Howdy folks, it's Will here from Flow Mountain Bike. Now on my right, I've got a bike fitted with RockShox Flight Attendant, and on my left, a bike fitted with Fox Live Valve. Both of these are automated electronic suspension systems, but the way they work and the way they go about things on the trail is very different. In order to dig into the details and the differences between both systems, over the past 6 months, we've been testing 4 different bikes, 2 with Flight Attendant and 2 with Live Valve. And in this video, we'll be going through some of those differences and what we like about each system, what we don't like about each system, and what improvements we'd like to see in the future. Now, I'll point out here that this video will be more of a broad overview. If you want more information, we've just published a juicy feature which is now live over at flowmountainbike.com. Click the link in the video description below to check it out. It's free to access, just like everything else is over at flowmountainbike.com. Speaking of things that are free for you to do, if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, make sure you do that right now because it does help us to put together video reviews just like this one. Without further ado, let's get stuck into the review. So first up, we're going to talk RockShox Flight Attendant, which arrived late last year to a lot of fanfare, courtesy of its wireless design and the fact that it is extremely exclusive, only coming on a handful of very high-end bikes. Now, in some ways, Flight Attendant is RockShox's answer to Fox Live Valve, but in other ways, it's also the modern evolution of the EI system that Lapierre, Ghost and Highbike developed with RockShox nearly a decade ago. While Flight Attendant is quite different, the concept is much the same, and it's all about improving the efficiency of your bike by the system taking control of the settings of both the fork and the rear shock. Now, there are 3 components that make up Flight Attendant. We've got a fork module, which sits atop a special Flight Attendant charger damper, which you can get in the Pike, the Lyric or the Zeb. There's a rear shock module, which is integrated into a special Flight Attendant specific Super Deluxe shock. And then we've got a pedal sensor. Okay, so the way that Flight Attendant works, it is essentially the opposite to Live Valve. So instead of being in a firm position and waiting for a bump to open up the suspension, Flight Attendant defaults to the open position. So the suspension is fully open, just like a normal trail bike. When you start pedaling, that pedal sensor sends a signal up to the fork module, which is the brains behind the whole operation, and it suggests to the system that it should firm up the suspension. But before it does that, the fork module checks in with a variety of other sensors. So inside the fork module and the rear shock module, you've got an accelerometer, which is there to measure bump forces. Not just the severity of the bumps, but the frequency of the bumps. There's also an inclinometer in both of those modules, and that is to detect pitch. So basically the system can work out whether you're climbing, whether you're on the flats, or whether you're descending. Now, on top of that, the system also takes into account historical data. So it looks at the past 5 seconds of trail behind you to then work out what the trail ahead of you is likely to do. So it takes on board all of that information from the pedal sensor, those accelerometers and the inclinometer, and the algorithm makes some 200 calculations per second to work out whether the suspension should be in one of 3 settings, whether it should be in open, in the pedal mode, or lock. Now, it's only affecting the compression damping, and that's in both the fork and the rear shock, and it adjusts that compression damping using a tiny little servo motor, which is actually the same as what you'll find in an Axis derailleur or an Axis reverb dropper post, and it's powered by the same Axis battery, again you'll find in the dropper and the rear derailleur. And it makes that adjustment according to RockShox, in 5 milliseconds, so it's quite fast. Now, the system will typically adjust both the fork and the rear shock at the same time, but it won't necessarily put them into the same mode. When this happens, and there are certain situations on the trail where the system will make this decision, RockShox calls it split mode, and it'll often put RockShox calls this split mode, where it puts the fork into a softer position than the rear shock. And you can tell this via the LED array on top of the fork module, and you'll be able to tell because there'll be 2 green LEDs illuminated at the same time, with the fork being the softer of those 2 settings. As for what we really like about Flight Attendant, well, firstly, it's super clean thanks to that wireless setup. RockShox has pretty much nailed the ergonomics and the user interface with this. We really like having the matching left-hand controller, which isn't essential to the Flight Attendant system, but it does give you the option to remotely access the override function, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it does mean that the handlebar is basically a mirror image on the left and the right-hand side. It gives your thumbs a nice consistent surface on each side. It's just really a pleasure to use. The user interface has been great. Both the fork modules, quite easy to change modes and adjust settings, but also the app that SRAM has developed for Flight Attendant. It makes it really easy to pair the whole system to start off with, to calibrate the system. We've had no issues with pairing, with setup, or with having to perform any firmware updates because something has stopped working. It's basically been flawless since day one. That aside, on the trail, the efficiency benefits that Flight Attendant brings to a big travel bike is pretty profound. It's worth acknowledging that a lot of long travel forks on the market don't have lockouts or compression switches. And so the added stability that you get from Flight Attendant putting the fork into that pedal or the lock position, it's pretty noticeable on a smooth climb. Obviously you get improved efficiency through the back end as well. But it's not just about improving the pedal efficiency and reducing the energy loss to pedal bob. It's also about the improvement to dynamic stability, which is something you notice on technical climbs where you're kind of moving around the cockpit a lot more. Because the rear shock isn't kind of wallowing into its travel, you get more ground clearance underneath the pedals, and the seat angle remains in a steeper position, puts you in a more powerful pedaling position on those climbs. Now, it's worth acknowledging that Flight Attendant isn't necessarily doing anything different compared to you reaching down and adjusting a 3-position compression switch on your rear shock or your fork. But unless you're reaching down every 2 seconds to your fork and shock, making adjustments all the time, there's just no way that you can be as responsive or as effective as Flight Attendant. And so the benefit there is that the suspension is in those firmer positions more of the time when you just wouldn't bother to reach down and adjust the lockout on the shock or the fork. So we found there were situations where this was really prevalent, like on an undulating ridgeline trail with sort of steep technical pinch climbs and steep technical descents. Now on those sorts of trails, we just leave the suspension wide open, mostly so we didn't forget to unlock the suspension for those descents. But of course with Flight Attendant, it does that for you. You get the benefit of the suspension stiffening up for the climbs, again, so you're getting that improved efficiency and improved dynamic stability. But then as soon as you hit that first bump on the way down, the suspension opens up, so you can forget about descending with the suspension accidentally locked out ever again. And on that note, it's really how seamless this system is on the trail that has impressed us most about Flight Attendant. Also, the fact that the performance of the suspension in the open position is outstandingly good. So putting the electronic trickery aside, the performance from this Flight Attendant Lyric and the Flight Attendant Super Deluxe Shock is fantastic. Amazing small bump sensitivity, very smooth, very supple, and very well controlled on bigger hits. And because the suspension is so good in that open position, it makes having the Flight Attendant, that automated electronic control, worth having in the first place. As for what we don't like about RockShox Flight Attendant, well, for a start, it is very expensive. This bike next to me here is around 13,000 Australian dollars. Of course, it is more complicated. You've got more batteries with Flight Attendant. These are the same batteries as what you'll find in an Axis mech and a Reverb Axis dropper post. And look, at the end of the day, if you can leave your house with your mobile phone charged, you probably won't have any issues keeping on top of charging these batteries. But there are 2 more things that you do need to stay on top of. It also takes a few rides to get used to the noisy motors inside the fork module and rear shock module. It actually does sound kind of cool, but there have been rides where I found the noise to be a little bit distracting. The noise is definitely louder compared to the Axis derailleur and the Reverb dropper post, possibly because they're a little bit closer to your ears, but it also sounds like the motors are working a little bit harder in the fork module and in the shock module. If you're a particularly sensitive rider, you might find the noise and those LEDs to be a little bit distracting. The LEDs, you can turn the fork module into like a stealth dark mode, but you will find that every time the suspension makes an adjustment, you will get a bright green flash from that fork module. So that's something to bear in mind. The other downside is that on the trail, if you're in the lock position and you're riding along a smooth section of trail and you come across a rock garden, when you hit that first rock, the suspension might not unlock instantaneously. It's certainly not as quick to react as live valve. Now, we're not sure if this is due to the wireless design, whether the fact that the accelerometer in the fork module is at the top of the fork and not on the unsprung mass on the lowers, or whether it's due to the mechanical nature of the servos. Whatever it is, it's just not as quick to react as live valve. So there are specific situations where you might feel the impact of that first bump before the suspension opens up and unlocks for the remainder of that section. There are also some occasions where Flight Attendant wouldn't necessarily pick the suspension mode that we would pick, and this just simply takes time to get used to how the system is interpreting the data that's coming through the sensors and how it's making a decision based on that data. So on sort of really like choppy technical climbs, there are occasions where if you do hit something hard enough, the suspension would open up. And particularly with the rear shock, if you go from sort of a firm setting to unlocked, it can kind of drop into the travel quite a bit. And you can kind of feel like the bike is being robbed of momentum as the seat angle kind of slackens out at the same time. Now, there are sort of ways around this. We did make use of the override function with the left-hand controller. We set that up to default to the pedal mode. So if we knew a technical climb was coming up, we just put the override into the pedal mode, which gives you increased compression damping, it gives you more support, but it still gives you some traction to both the rear shock and the fork, and it gives you a predictable, consistent suspension mode for that section of trail. So that's really good for known technical climbs. The other thing you can do is increase the bias setting. So I typically ran the bias at +1 or +2, which meant the suspension was more likely to pick the pedal or the lock settings. It was more likely to firm up in situations where if you have the bias setting in -1 or -2, where it would stay open. It meant the suspension was more predictable, which I appreciated for those technical climbs. And it also meant the suspension was more likely to go into the split mode, again with the fork in that softer mode with the rear shock in a firmer setting. To be honest, we kind of like to see Flight Attendant pick that split mode more of the time. And in fact, we think some trail and enduro riders would probably prefer if the fork didn't actually lock out at all on those technical climbs and still sat into its travel a little bit. As for what we think could be improved about Flight Attendant, well, it'll be interesting to see if RockShox could speed up that lag time between the system detecting a bump and then opening up, so it's a bit more instantaneous like live valve. We'd like to see independent adjustability between the fork and the rear shock, and perhaps even the option to limit the fork so it was only adjusting between the open and the pedal settings and not locking out at all. We're also curious to see whether RockShox might develop a future version of Flight Attendant which is just the rear shock on its own, because that's ultimately where the biggest advantage is in terms of efficiency and climbing stability comes from. We guarantee that RockShox has to be working on a cross-country version of this system as well. It'll be really interesting to see whether they can get the system to be a little bit lighter, because currently it's around a 300-gram weight penalty compared to a non-Flight Attendant setup. So whether they can bring that weight difference down for a cross-country version. But we know that there's plenty of cross-country bikes on the market that have a rat's nest of cables out on their cockpit, and going to a wireless setup with something like Flight Attendant would be really appealing. Lastly, we'd just like to see the price of entry lowered. To get onto Flight Attendant, you're going to be spending a lot of money, and all the bikes that it comes fitted to also have Axis drivetrains and Axis dropper post. They're all on carbon frames with carbon wheels, all the bells and whistles, and that means that the entry price point is quite high. Flight Attendant doesn't have to be on a carbon frame with an Axis drivetrain. So we look forward to seeing this technology hopefully trickling down into cheaper price brackets. Okay, so Fox Live Valve. Now, this system has actually been on the market since 2018, but the hype around Live Valve has obviously died down a lot since then. Fox actually ushered in an updated version of Live Valve at the end of 2021, and we've been testing this system for over 6 months now, both on the Trance 29 and on the Giant Anthem as well. There have been some significant improvements with this Live Valve 1.5 system. For a start, the rear shock has a new main piston which has been borrowed from the Float X2 downhill shock. There are also new sensors inside the main controller, and that's designed to improve this bike's pitch detection, so it's more accurate in detecting when you're climbing or descending. And lastly, the controller is now Bluetooth compatible, and Fox has developed a smartphone app which gives you a whole lot more adjustability over the settings of the Live Valve system. So aesthetically, the Live Valve 1.5 system, it looks exactly the same. So we've got a special Live Valve shock, and then we've also got a Live Valve damper, which is available in a 32, 34, 36, 38 series forks. And then underneath the top tube in the middle of the frame here, we've got the main controller and the primary battery, which powers the whole system. And from here, there are 4 wires that snake their way through to the frame. One wire goes to the fork damper, one goes to the Live Valve shock. Then you've also got the 2 sensors. So there's a front sensor, which sits on the back of the fork arch, and you've got the rear sensor, which sits inside the rear dropout. Those sensors are accelerometers, so they're basically detecting bumps and bump forces. And then, as I said before, we've got pitch detection inside the main controller, and that's designed to work out whether you're climbing on the flats or descending. Okay, so the way that Live Valve works is the system is adjusting the fork and the shock between 2 preset compression settings, open or firm. The default setting is firm, so as we've got here, both the fork and the shock are in that firm setting. Now, it's not a full lockout. There's still a certain amount of movement there. It's not a hard lockout. It's more a firm compression mode. So the shock can sag a little bit into its travel, and same thing with the fork. Now, when you hit a bump that's big enough to trip the sensors, which is big enough for that threshold, the suspension will flip into the open position to absorb the impact from that bump. Now, according to Fox, it does this in just 3 milliseconds. Now, that's the time it takes for the sensor to detect a bump and for then the system to open up the fork and the rear shock. So it's very, very fast, basically instantaneous. It's able to do this so quickly because it uses what's called a latching solenoid. It's basically a tiny electromagnet, very compact, also doesn't use a lot of energy, and it means the whole system can be powered off this single battery, which according to Fox will get you about 16 to 20 hours of ride time. When the suspension is in that open mode, a timer starts inside the controller. And that will leave the suspension open for a predetermined value. Now, here's where it gets quite clever. The system, as I said before, it can detect whether you're descending on the flats or climbing, and how long the timer stays open changes depending on those parameters. All right, come this way, we're going to show you something cool. We're going to demonstrate how Live Valve adjusts the suspension based on whether you're climbing or descending. Now, what you want to listen for here is a clicking noise, which is the latching solenoid opening or closing the valve, depending on the gradient of the terrain. So first, let's demonstrate climbing. Now let's do descending. Now let's simulate going off a jump, free fall.
Cool, huh?
So cool.
Yeah, it's cool. Pretty impressive.
It's amazing. It's not that much of a difference, but it changes the system completely. There you go.
There you go.
There's also a lesser known fact about Fox Live Valve is that the suspension isn't always in the same mode front and rear. So not unlike RockShox Flight Attendant where you've got that split mode, Live Valve also does the same thing. So there are some situations where, say on a technical climb, where the fork may open up, but the rear shock may stay in that firm setting. What we like about Fox Live Valve is the same as Flight Attendant, the fact that there are no handlebar remotes to toggle, levers on the fork or shock to toggle. You just jump on the bike and ride and let the system kind of choose the best mode for the situation at hand. We like how efficient this suspension design is, and the fact that Live Valve is mostly in that firm setting and only opens up when it's necessary, it means that overall the bikes that we've ridden with Live Valve, they do feel quite a bit more efficient compared to Flight Attendant. Also nice about live valve is that when the suspension does open up, it closes quite quickly. So the oscillation that you'd normally get with a wide open suspension design, it doesn't really happen. It sort of opens up, compresses once, and then you return to that nice stable platform. And that kind of encourages you to get back on the pedals, get back on the gas, and just charge. Also the dynamic stability it brings to climbing. Yes, it improves efficiency, but same thing with Flight Attendant. The way that this system kind of lifts the bottom bracket height, steepens the effective seat tube angle. It's really beneficial when you're climbing, whether that's on a smooth climb or a technical climb. We've really noticed that benefit on the Trance 29, which has a very low bottom bracket height. Now, without live valve, we would normally flip the geometry chip into the high position because otherwise in low, you're kind of clipping the pedals all the time. But with live valve, the suspension rides so much higher in its travel more of the time. So it meant we could get away with leaving the flip chip in the low position. So we get that nice ground huggy feel through the corners and on the descents. But with live valve taking care of things, you still get good pedal clearance on the technical climb, so you're not bashing the cranks and the pedals all the time. One of the strongest suits of live valve is just how fast it is to react. So with that latching solenoid, the transition between firm and open is super quick. It's quite a seamless transition. It's basically impossible to feel that on the trail. So you can ride flat out into a rock garden and the suspension opens up almost instantaneously. It makes it quite seamless, especially with the new main piston inside the rear shock, which offers better performance on the descents. That's something we've noticed on the Anthem, which is a lightweight cross-country race bike. But on the descents, it's a very plush, very grounded, it feels more like a trail bike with excellent traction and really good big hit control. As for the downsides of live valve, well, it hasn't exactly enjoyed flawless reviews since its inception. Indeed, the 2021 Giant Trans X that we tested, we found the suspension on that to be a little too firm, particularly the fork, which felt over-damped even in the open position. Thankfully, there have been noticeable improvements with this 1.5 version. The tunes feel more appropriate, which is particularly the case with this Trance 29, where the firm setting for the fork has been tuned to be quite a bit softer, which generally suits aggressive trail riding a lot better. That said, the live valve damper is still based on Fox's Fit 4 damper architecture. So the suspension performance in that open position, it's just never going to be as buttery plush or as sensitive as the superior Grip 2 damper. Also, because of the bump threshold that's built into this system, basically any bump that you hit that is underneath that threshold, you're pretty much going to feel through the bike. As I said before, the suspension isn't locked out in that firm position, it's just a firm compression mode, but you are still going to get more feedback, particularly on the smaller rubble that isn't big enough to trip the sensors. This is something that becomes apparent the longer that you ride and the more that you fatigue throughout the ride. If you're not riding assertively enough, particularly over the front of the bike to trip those sensors, again, you're going to get more feedback and it's going to be more uncomfortable the longer you ride. There is more weight in the live valve system, so on the Giant Anthem that we were testing, we weighed the live valve fork, shock controller and battery and compared it to the non-live valve version, and you're looking at around a 300 gram weight penalty, which isn't a big deal for trail riders, but for World Cup cross-country races, it is perhaps more of a big deal.
Again.
Obviously, being a wired system, it's pretty messy. There are a lot of electronic wires around the cockpit here. There's more wires that you need to manage to stop them flapping about and causing noise. We did also have a failure with one of the wires on our Trance 29 test bike. So we did replace the live valve controller, which meant we got quite intimate with all of the internal routing and the necessary foam that's required to stop the cables sort of making noise inside the frame. So it does require more careful management because you do have so many wires with this system. In terms of what we think could be improved with live valve, well, at the moment it does feel like it is one system that's designed to cover a pretty broad spectrum of different bikes. So in the future, we can kind of see live valve splitting into two different directions, one that's dedicated for cross-country and one for trail and enduro. For cross-country racing, we do see there being benefit to having perhaps a remote sprint button up at the handlebar for engaging a full lockout. We'd also like to see a bit more adjustability for the open and the firm settings, and independent adjustability between the fork and the rear shock. We also think for trail riding, the rear shock is really where you're going to get most benefit from the live valve system. So we do see future versions potentially just having a live valve rear shock and leaving the fork as a standard fork. And that would open up the option to run the superior Grip 2 damper. It would also tidy up the handlebar considerably by removing 2 cables for the front. Following on from that, an obvious area for an improvement would be to make the whole system wireless. Whether Fox can make the system as fast reacting with a wireless signal compared to the wired setup is yet to be seen. And there you have it, folks. There's an overview of our experience of testing RockShox Flight Attendant versus Fox Live Valve. We hope you've enjoyed this video, but if you are thirsty for more knowledge on these clever electronic suspension systems, then make sure you check out the full review over at flowmountainbike.com. We've been totally fascinated by both Flight Attendant and Live Valve, and we're excited to see what the future holds for both of these systems. Now, if you've got any questions for us about either of them, make sure you drop those into the comments below. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. Otherwise, I'm going to get out of the cold and rain and warm myself up. I'll hopefully see you guys next time. Tooroo! Woohoo! Oh, glamorous world of mountain bike media.
Is this waterproof?
We're gonna find out. Oh.